Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. We are very excited to be here today with Dr. Nell Duke. She's a professor at the University of Michigan. We have been big fans of Nell Duke since I worked at city schools, Melissa. I remember having Nell come in and she did a little small group presentation, and I was thrilled to hear everything that she had to say and all of the research that she shared. So, Melissa, I know you're really excited to talk with her too.
Yeah, Nell Duke is a big deal in Baltimore because she came to talk to us so much. So we are very excited to talk to her about some of her new articles that she has. So, yeah.
Welcome, Nell.
Wait.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we'd love for you to just start by sharing just a bit about yourself. I know that you have a wonderful website, nellkduke.org, so we can send everybody there if they'd like to learn more. But if you could just give us like a brief little bio, and we'd love to hear that from you so we can frame it for our listeners. Who are you, and what are we going to talk about today?
Right. Well, I'm a professor, as you said, at the University of Michigan. I'm in two programs. One's called Literacy, Language, and Culture, and the other is the combined program in Education and Psychology. I study early literacy development, birth to age 8. I can stretch to the end of elementary school, but really do focus primarily on our youngest learners and how we lay a foundation for literacy success throughout their lifetimes. A lot of my work has focused on informational text and how we lay a foundation for that for young children. I also work a lot on reading comprehension development in young children and on issues of equity in literacy education. In recent years, I've been writing about really all aspects of literacy education, just mainly because if we can't get the foundational skills right, then there's not going to be much room to do comprehension and informational text in the areas that I've done research on. And so I've been doing a lot more work trying to really get, share more information about how to do research-aligned foundational skills instruction. And I've also been doing a lot of work on project-based learning in the last many years.
Excellent.
Basically, no big deal, right? Just your everyday run-of-the-mill literacy stuff.
I always tried to get Nell to come to Baltimore to talk to our secondary literacy teachers, and she's like, "That is not my thing. Don't." I'm not talking to them. But she gave me great people to talk to.
That is funny. Oh my gosh. Well, we're excited to talk with you today, Nell, because you've written a couple pieces lately that we want to draw some attention to, and hopefully after this conversation with you, shift our language to be more intentional. I know we always reference Scarborough's rope, and Melissa and I reference that often in our podcast and in our literacy lives. But I think after reading your pieces, it's important to be really intentional with our language. And now that we know more, we're going to do better and use different language to address the Scarborough's rope, if you will, that you've, I guess, updated, revised, added to, edited. So we'd love to hear a little bit about the research that you've done and your pieces that we're going to talk about today. So do you want to frame a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Thanks. So I co-authored the piece that you're referring to, and I'll read the exact title for your listeners here. It's The Science of Reading Progresses, Communicating Advances Beyond the Simple View of Reading. And it appeared in Reading Research Quarterly in May, and it is freely available online. It's not behind a paywall, I'm glad to say. So in that article, what Kelly Cartwright and I tried to do is to both acknowledge, the real significance of the simple view of reading, which probably many of your listeners have heard of, but just briefly, this is a model of reading that was put forth in 1985 by Goff and Tumner. And in that model, reading is posited to be a product, and that's very important. So the time symbol here, a product of two components: decoding and listening comprehension. And already some of your listeners might be like, wait a minute, I didn't think it was decoding and listening comprehension. In the original article in 1985, it really was actually decoding and listening comprehension, or a few times in the article they used linguistic comprehension. It's much more recently that other researchers and writers have broadened those terms to word recognition and language comprehension. And that's actually a substantial improvement over the model right there. It captures a lot more data when we use those broader terms of word recognition and language comprehension. Anyway, so that's the simple view of reading. So that was originated in 1985. And then, as you've mentioned, there's Scarborough's rope model of reading that was put forth in 2001. And it's a model that I've drawn on a lot in my own work. I think I very much admire that model. I think it has so much going for it. But of course, it's been 20 years. And, just as in medicine and public health, we don't, have the same understandings now as we had 20 years ago, right? Our knowledge continues to advance. That's how science works. Same in literacy. So there's some things we know now that we didn't know in 2001 or in 1985 with the simple view of reading. And so what Kelly Cartwright and I did in this recent article was we just tried to update some things. So point out some things that we know now that we didn't know then, that seem important for teachers and for educators to understand. And that's really where our focus was, is what are some things that it's important, for the field to understand. We tried to pull that all together in a model we're calling the active view of reading. And there's a sort of colorful graphic in the article that represents that model. But there are other, updated models out there. Listeners, may have another model that they prefer. And we actually talk about a number of them and draw attention to a number of updated models of reading within the paper itself. So, there are a lot of possibilities out there. I think our biggest message was we do need to move beyond model from 1985 because we just know more, and when we know more, as you say, we do more. So, yeah. So I could talk about some of the key differences of the model. Would that be useful?
Yeah, that would be great. Can I just really quickly, I love that you all are talking about, I think we often talk about science of reading as if it's this like static thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, does this align with the science of reading as if it's like, just like these 5 bullet points that are never going to change? So I just love the idea of that, when we talk about science, especially, it's going to continue to change and we need to continue to be okay with it evolving. So I'm just,
Melissa, that is such a great point. I'm so glad that you took the time to point that out, because I think you're absolutely right. Seems like a lot of people do think of science of reading as like a static, like body of settled knowledge. And that, there's certainly some things that we feel pretty confident about from the research at this point, but we're always going to have, evolving understandings. I think of it, if you use the analogy of vaccination, the science of vaccination 3 years ago and the science of vaccination today are quite different because we have new techniques and we have, new understandings and new phenomena, new tech paces in which we can develop vaccines. I mean, there's just so many things that have changed. And so, similarly in literacy, part of what it means for us to be professionals is that we embrace not the swinging of a pendulum, not bandwagons, not, what the latest guru says. That's not what we embrace, but we embrace that research studies over time accumulate and typically converge on particular understandings. So thanks for making that point.
Yeah. And I was going to say, it feels like you all are building on what's already been kind of settled, if you want to use that word. But, it's not like, let's throw all this stuff away because something new came out of the science, but it's, okay, we have some things in place, but there are some new things that we can add in or change or shift the way we look at it.
That's absolutely right. And I hope that the piece came through. We certainly intended to write it, as very respectful of, and, just a next step in, these important models that have come before. And in fact, I hope that 20 years from now, people aren't using the active view of reading anymore. I hope that 20 years from now, they have, another more updated model that adds additional or adjusts additionally. So that's our hope.
I think too, to add to that, it's a lot of deepening what's already been done. So it's for me, it called out some more specific pieces that can only help us moving forward versus, like you said, swinging the pendulum. Like, this is definitely not that, because there are core pieces that are staying grounded within, but then there are pieces that are being fleshed out a little bit more. So I think we're excited to hear from you a little bit more about that, some examples of those pieces that are being deepened, if you will.
Sure. Great. So one really key piece is that in both the rope model and the simple view model, the components of word recognition and language comprehension, or in earlier form, decoding and listening comprehension, are depicted as largely separate. In the rope model, they eventually pull together, which is really, I think, a very nice metaphor of that braiding of the rope. But in actuality, what we know from research is that there are actually some knowledge and skills that bridge those two constructs. That is, the D and the LC aren't entirely separate, actually. There are these things that are sort of the integration of the D and the LC in the simple view. We call those bridging processes. And what we know about them is that they both affect and are affected by both language comprehension and by word recognition. So I can give you just a few examples of some of these. One is reading fluency, which I know, your listeners are probably really familiar with. So, reading fluency is obviously very affected by your word recognition, but it's also affected by your language comprehension and affects your language comprehension. So it encompasses really both of those, particularly when you're looking at the more the sort of prosody or expression, the aspects of fluency that have to do most closely with representing language, if you will. And so that's one, a really important one that, again, I know your listeners are very familiar with, is vocabulary knowledge. So traditionally, people think of vocabulary knowledge as just over in the language comprehension part of things. But what we know from research is that actually vocabulary knowledge affects word recognition. So you're actually, if you have a higher vocabulary knowledge, if you know the words that you're now attempting to decode, it improves your ability to decode them. So that vocabulary really is a reflection of and affects both word recognition and language comprehension. Why does that matter? Well, if you have a student who is struggling with word recognition, one of the possibilities that has to be considered is that part, or maybe even all, but probably part of that, is a vocabulary issue for that child, and not just an issue of, for example, graphophonemic knowledge, or knowledge of the relationships between graphemes and phonemes and words. And if you don't realize that, you could be putting a kid through more and more phonics intervention, when what they really also need is a heavy dose of vocabulary and concept knowledge intervention. So that's one of the reasons why, it's just practically helpful to think of vocabulary as that bridging skill. And I'm excited to say that this week, I read a new article out, and I won't remember all the authors' names, but I know Sharon Vaughn was one of them, with 4th and 5th graders, in which they tested word reading instruction for kids who are at risk for reading difficulty. Word reading instruction alone versus word reading instruction plus vocabulary. And the word reading instruction plus vocabulary group grew more in their word reading. So that's a great example of how, really thinking of this as a bridging skill, and acknowledging and understanding the relationship of vocabulary to both word recognition and language comprehension can really help our learners. So that's and a couple of examples, fluency and vocabulary, of those bridging processes. I'll just quickly mention the others. We put in the model print concepts. So, understanding how language works, for example, that we read from left to right in English, That has historically, in the rope model is under language comprehension, but in fact, you've got to know that left to right directionality in order to read words, right? So it also affects word recognition.
Yeah.
Morphological awareness we put in there. That's awareness of those, smallest meaningful chunks within words. And morphological awareness is another one that has been shown in many studies to be related to both word recognition and language comprehension and morphology intervention. So when you go in and you teach kids prefixes and suffixes and roots, that actually can improve both word reading and reading comprehension. So morphological knowledge has a place. And then the last one is a bit of a mouthful, so bear with me. But the last one that we put in the active view of reading in the bridging processes section is graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility.
Which I'm really glad you broke it out into what it means just underneath of it.
So it's graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility. So what does that mean? So graphophonological, graphemes and phonemes, or roughly speaking, not quite accurate, but letters and sounds. And then semantic, meaning, and then cognitive, mental flexibility. So this is basically your brain's ability to essentially simultaneously consider both the graphophonological structure of words, the sort of decoding aspects of words, and to consider what those words mean, or to very, very actively and quickly switch between those. So you both do that very well, I'm sure. So you're just able to handle both of those at the same time in your minds. But we know that adults and children, both, research has been done with both, who have difficulty with reading are often not as good at that. It's harder for their brains to, pay attention simultaneously to these two things. And you can see how this is a bridging skill, right? It's a direct example of a bridging between word recognition and language comprehension. And fortunately, there is now intervention research that shows that we can do some things that actually train brains to pay attention to both of those more together, become more flexible, and that improves reading comprehension. So those are some of the bridging processes. That's one, big piece of our model that I think is important for teachers to understand. And then I think the other, big piece is really just we've added some things, some constructs to the model that weren't there previously that are important to reading. One piece we've added is called theory of mind.
Yeah.
I like that
we were talking about that right before we talked to you. We're like, what? Remind me what theory of mind is.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it is a construct that's been around a long time. In particularly research on preschool or very early childhood development, but more recently, there's been more work on theory of mind and reading. And theory of mind is basically our ability to think about what someone else is thinking or what someone else is feeling. So kind of putting ourselves in someone else's perspective. And it's very important to narrative comprehension, right? In order to really understand a story, you have to understand what the characters in that story are thinking, feeling, like their motivations. And so that's where theory of mind has implications for reading. So that's one example of something we added to the model. And then a whole bubble of our model, if you see it, you'll know what I mean by bubble, but
we'll link it.
Yeah, is active self-regulation. And so this is a cluster of things we put together that really fall under the broad umbrella of active reading and self-regulative reading. So it's first of all, motivation and engagement, just being motivated to read and then sustaining that motivation over time. Some researchers call volition, and being engaged in that reading. We know that that interventions to improve motivation can actually improve reading. To improve reading motivation can actually improve reading. The relationship, like lots of these constructs, is complex because reading ability also affects motivation. right?
Right,
so,
right.
So it's kind of a two-way, but the purpose of our model was to talk about things that influence reading rather than things that reading influences, if that makes sense. So we focus on how motivation and engagement influence reading. We also included executive function. And again, this is one that is an area where there's really been an explosion of research and, still sorting out a lot of the technical issues. But for the purposes of your listeners, if you think about some of the children or students that you may have had over the years where it seems like part of their challenge is sustaining their attention to what they're reading, keeping their mind from wandering.
Yeah. We always called it stamina. Stamina is what we
Stamina, stamina. And we talk about as inhibitory control. So can you stop yourself from going off on a mental tangent? And I think we can all relate that sometimes we can't, right? We're reading along and we read about a character's, is doing laundry and all of a sudden we're thinking about our own laundry and we're realizing we didn't get it done last week, right? So the ability to sort of suppress those thoughts and stay focused on what you're reading is called inhibitory control. And for people who have difficulty with things like that, reading comprehension can be more difficult. And so that's an example of where that executive function piece has fallen in. And it is interesting to see that there are a growing number of interventions where, usually researchers aren't intervening on just executive function, but when they combine intervention on executive function with intervention on other aspects of reading, that additional attention to executive function seems to be well worth it.
Now, do you mind doing like a quick little tangential piece? What would that look like? Because I'm still sitting here thinking about the laundry that I need to put in the dryer.
Me too. My laundry's in the washer, and now I had to make a note for myself.
That's what I was thinking. I'm going to put it in my notebook right now to after this podcast change the laundry, so I can forget about it in my head. I'm constantly making notes to myself. That's my strategy, but I'm curious as to what an actual strategy would be other than putting it on a Post-it and remembering.
I love it. I think we all can relate, especially us very busy, multitasking professionals who have a job and the home and the kids and we can relate. You're giving me a bit of an opening to talk about strategy instruction because some of the strategy instruction models, part of what they're doing is helping really with some executive function kinds of issues. So a big part of it is teaching readers to do things in their minds that keep those minds actively focused on their reading. So one that's gotten a lot of attention in the research over a number of decades now, so this is a pretty long-standing area, is self-questioning. So asking yourself questions as you read. Why would the character do that? Or why would that be a waste product of this scientific, phenomenon? Or, so that self-questioning seems like it is one way that we keep readers more actively engaged in the reading and more focused on what they're reading. And indeed, research suggests, including in meta-analysis, that just teaching self-questioning can actually support reading comprehension, even though that's just one strategy. And some of the work in this area, why questions are especially important. So you might have noticed my examples, had that why question feel, getting at that why often forces us to make inferences and kind of to elaborate our understandings within a text. So that's an example of where you can be kind of simultaneously improving, what we traditionally think of as comprehension strategy use, but also that it can really support executive function. Another strategy that I want to talk about that certainly has overlap, I think, with executive function is comprehension monitoring. And this is so important, right? Paying attention to whether what you're reading is making sense. And let me be very clear that I'm not talking about using sense to guess at words. That's not something we recommend, but using ongoing attention to whether something is making sense as a way to flag whether you may have misread a word or that your mind is wandering, or, any number of other problems in your reading. Maybe you misunderstood a vocabulary word. Maybe you understood one meaning of it when the author intended a different meaning of it. Those are all things that we notice when we're engaged in comprehension monitoring. And stronger, more accomplished readers tend to be very good at comprehension monitoring. So, for example, if your mind wandered to the laundry, you would realize it after a bit, and I need to go back and reread. I wasn't paying any attention for the last, 2 paragraphs or whatever the case may be. So that comprehension monitoring is so important. And we do know from research, there are a lot of individual differences in that area. So some children are seemingly natural comprehension monitors. They just do pay attention to whether what they're reading makes sense, and they do stop or slow down if it doesn't. There's some really interesting eye tracking research that Carol Connor and colleagues did, where they showed, that our stronger readers really do slow way down when something is inconsistent or doesn't make sense. I think that's such an important finding. And just to go on a quick tangent, it's one of the reasons why sending students the message that reading faster is always better is really problematic, right? Because we know that those really strong readers are in fact slowing down more than less strong readers when they're hitting those rough patches, right?
Yeah, I have to undo a lot of that in my little one, because she thinks, and she's going into 4th grade, but she does not stop when it doesn't make sense, or the word, she's saying the word that could be said 2 different ways. She's saying it the way that it's not intended in the text, and then just keeps going. And I find myself saying what you're saying in a very child-friendly way to her often, like, good readers reread and think about if it makes sense. And if it doesn't, then we go back and reread. She's like, I just want to get it done. I'm like, that's not the point, And then I do a lot of modeling to be like, oh my gosh, this doesn't make sense here. And I'm thinking, is she even listening to me? But it's that it's reaffirming to hear that is, the right thing to do. And that it's important to do that, because it's really hard to make sense of what you're reading if you're not going back and slowing down and reading. I would love to learn more about that eye tracking research. That's really intriguing. I'm going to try to find some of that after this podcast.
Yeah, if you have any trouble, let me know. I'm happy to share. I do think that is really intriguing. And what you're doing with your daughter is just so important. And it's important to her comprehension, which of course is the point of reading, but it's also important to her word recognition development, because if she speeds through those words, having read them incorrectly, then what she's doing is she's orthographically mapping the wrong
word
pronunciation onto that word. And we don't want that either. So that comprehension monitoring is one of our protections or guards against kids doing the wrong orthographic mapping in their mind. So it's really so important. So just practically speaking, I mean, we teach comprehension monitoring the way that we teach so many things. You explicitly explain it and we model it. I'm sure that's, what sounds like you were doing with your daughter, explicitly explaining why this is so important. But there are also some little tricks. One thing is, kids just putting a little check mark at the end of each line they understood and a question mark if they didn't. And just, kind of training, therefore, that they're like paying attention each line to whether what they've read is making sense to them, instead of checking in about it, every few pages or something.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's what I'm going to do when I go back and reread this weekend. I'm going to use that strategy.
The article.
Yes, the big one, the heavy one that we're talking about, the science of reading progresses. I'm going to use your strategy. Thank you, Nell.
Thank you so much.
I was definitely self-monitoring when reading that.
I love it. So anyway, so those are some of the key, differences between our model and those past models. Again, very much building on them, but just extending. And as I said, one hopes that 20 years from now, maybe even 5 years from now, maybe even right now, researchers will say, I think you should add this, or I think this should be in this bubble, not this bubble, or, because that is, again, how science works. We read lots of studies. That's what I do Saturday night. Sit down with those research journals. It's a very wonderful life here I have. Read research studies and synthesize, thousands of studies in your mind to try to kind of sort out and map out the field.
Yeah. Yeah. You're in good company. That's what, I was thinking about doing this at the pool this weekend with a pina colada and using the strategies.
And that's what she already synthesized for you, Lori.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, a few things here on that, Lori. First of all, I think it's important for your listeners to know that I did apologize to you for the fact that you were thinking you needed to read this article at the pool this weekend.
Reread it again. But this is such an important article. A pina colada can help. But this is such an important article to read again and again and again that, I am willing to read it with a pina colada in hand at the pool this weekend for you. But, I do want to talk a little bit about, this is incredible work now first, but I do want to shift a little bit to, thinking about my daughter and what I just shared. She is, she just finished 3rd grade and she's heading into 4th grade. And I know that that's a time where educators might use phrases such as she's, quote, transitioning from learning to read to reading to learn. And, after reading your piece and knowing everything that, Melissa and I always talk about, how decoding and language comprehension go hand in hand, straight up from birth to all the way through adulthood. We'd like to talk a little bit about those phrases and the impact of them, as well as, just how, I don't know. Melissa, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say what I had in my mind the whole time that Nell was talking was that I've said this like a million times on the podcast, but during my letters training, I had a teacher who said well, if this is just so key to becoming a good reader, why don't we just start with word recognition and spend all of our time there and make sure that every student has it down pat before we go on to anything else? And in my mind, I'm like, no. There's so many other things that are so important. We can't just stay there for years.
Yeah.
So similarly, I had that in my mind of we have to, I love the idea of the bridging processes because it really shows that these things do go together, right? We can't separate them out like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Both of you are making, I think, such important points for your listeners to hear. And just to kind of give some credence to what each of you said. So starting with what you were saying, Lori, about this sort of traditional idea of first we read to learn. First, I can't even say it. I disagree with it so much. First, we learn to read, then we read to learn. That first of all, that idea comes from work in the 1960s, in which Jean Chall, in particular, was describing what typically happens in children's reading development, not what should happen in children's reading development. And in fact, one of the things I really admire about the late Dr. Chall's work is that she was a very strong advocate for more opportunities for children to engage with informational texts and learning through text in the earliest stages of reading. Mm-hmm. So it's not that she wanted it to be first learn to read, then read to learn. Yeah. She was just describing what was out there. She was actually advocating over many years. She was advocating for a different kind of model. So again, leads credence to your questioning of that idea. And then, Melissa, with your point, it's just so the letters training. The lead developer of that is Dr. Louisa Moats, and I know for a fact that Dr. Moats does not want people focusing on just word recognition and nothing else for the first few years of school. So, again, hopefully that leads credence to the idea that even the materials that maybe have led a few people to come to those conclusions, the very originators of those materials didn't want those conclusions. Mm-hmm. Exactly. We just simply, it just does not make any sense. And is not, I don't know any actual researchers who advise focusing on nothing but word recognition in the early years of schooling. Right away, we need to be concerned about comprehension development as well as development in other areas I've talked about, like, in executive function, for example. And that really, even very young children can handle texts that are designed for them to learn. So informational texts, being the kind of most obvious category. I did some research, and many others have done research in this area. But I'll just give you one example of a study that was published in 1995, I think. So let's pretend I was 10 years old at the time. So when I was 10 years old in 1995 and published an article with Jane Case in Early Childhood Research Quarterly, what we did is Jane Case is a teacher. So this was a teacher, researcher, practitioner partnership. She had kindergartners, and at the very beginning of the year, we asked the kindergartners individually to pretend to read two texts. One was very clearly a story, and it was clearly a fictional story. It was a Mercer Mayer story with monsters and so forth. And we covered up the words. So if there were kindergartners who could read, they wouldn't do so. It was to pretend to read it. Say what you think the book might say. And we also gave them an informational text that was designed to teach about firefighters and firefighting. And this text had real photographs and there was no storyline. I mean, it was very clearly an informational text. So we asked them to pretend to read these at the beginning of the year. And then after that, Jane Case read aloud to the children as information books and storybooks for 3 months. So each day for read aloud, she would make sure that she had a nice balance, like the Common Core state standards call for, but this was long before that, a nice balance between informational and narrative text. And then after the 3 months, we asked each kid individually to once again pretend to read those same two books, again, with the words covered up. And what we found was that the children differentiated. They're pretending to read. They're saying what they think the book might say. Those differentiated a lot more after 3 months than they had at the beginning of the year. When they were reading the information book, it sounded much more like an information book now. And the storybook sounded like a storybook. So there are all sorts of, I won't get into all the linguistic details, but for example, in information books, verbs are often timeless. So you might say like firefighters fight fires.
Right.
And that's timeless, right? It could be at any moment. Whereas in a storybook, usually verbs are timed and usually in past tense. So it would be something like the monster left the door, so what we found was that after 3 months, children were using more timeless verbs when they were pretending to read the information book and using more timed verbs when they were pretending to read the storybook. So they had already kind of picked up on this language difference between these two kinds of text. And what we argued was, if you can do that as a kindergartner after 3 months of some read alouds, clearly reading to learn is in your wheelhouse, right? Like clearly, you're able to handle these information books first as a listener, but of course, as by first grade, they can also handle them as readers themselves. So that's part of why, we disrupt both of those notions that the two of you brought up. And I know you both have long spoken against those as well, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. It's frustrating to hear it still, but I think it's such an opportunity to dig a little deeper and to hear the why. And whenever I do talk with a teacher, informally, who is still using that language, they don't actually usually mean it the way that it's said. They usually mean exactly what we are talking about. It's just because no teacher that I know is denying students the opportunity to access those texts, right? Like teachers are reading kids' books and they want them to learn to love books. I think it's just like you said, Nell, that the phrase became like catchy, even though it wasn't what it was intended. It was what it was happening versus what should be.
It's such an important point that you are making, because I think you're right. The vast majority of teachers are very interested in developing comprehension, not just listening comprehension, but also reading comprehension in those early years of schooling, and are interested in using informational text as well as narrative text. Sometimes it's more that like our language or our pronouncements or some of our policies haven't kind of caught up with, I think you're right, where many, many teachers are. And I do want to give due credit as well to curricula, which have shifted so much. I mean, earlier in my career, you would be hard pressed in primary grade curricula to find informational text. They were overwhelmingly stories and storybooks. And similarly, I think the Common Core really, state standards, and of course, I know, people have lots of opinions about them, and they're certainly not perfect, and they're certainly due for an update in any case. But the Common Core did make a very strong, pronouncement about the importance of informational text and learning from reading that I think did help to move the field along.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to add to that, with what Melissa, you had said about the teacher in letters training, I'm sure that if that newer teacher, if you really dug deep into like what she said, and you said, hey, does that mean that you wouldn't ever read the kids a book aloud about firefighters or whatever it might be? I'm sure her answer would be, oh no, yeah, you're right. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I think digging deep, I think it's just a catchphrase that feels really catchy and sounds great. But I think what we should shift it to, if I may, is learning is reading, reading is learning. And instead of, to, it should just say is, and it all is working together and collaboratively. So I'm going to throw that out there to the world. Maybe we can shift the narrative. We've got lots of listeners and lots of downloads. So take that with you, friends.
Well,
very nice, Lori.
We brought up this pendulum swing, and I think that we do that a lot in literacy, right? It's like we want it to be like one thing or the other thing or this thing. And, it really, there's so much balance and so many things that go in, that model of reading, the active view of reading model that you all created. There's so many things on there that we have to pay attention to all of them. I think sometimes people maybe it's a comfort thing, right? Like if I compartmentalize it a little, or like, let me just focus on one part first, it might feel a little bit better, but I think we all know that they're all important.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, I try to use, public health metaphors sometimes here because I think there are ways in which, literacy development is a public health issue for us and in this country. And, when public health advocates and researchers, are perfectly comfortable with the idea that we need good sleep, that we need a healthy diet, that we need to lower our stress, that we need to exercise, that we need to be in homes that are free of various kinds of environmental toxins, whether that's air pollution, lead, and I could go on. But when advocates are, trying to speak to the importance of one of those, say sleep, they typically don't denigrate all the others, and I think that's really the mentality that we need to adopt in our field. There are a lot of things that are important, and sure, they're going to be figure ground kinds of things. I'll be the first person to say, like, get word reading instruction right in first grade. We are in big trouble if we don't get that right. So of course that's going to be heavy on our mind, but it doesn't mean that we speak against or completely marginalize all of these other areas. And we look for those synergies, wherever we can. I also just want to kind of back again to really the wisdom of teachers. Some of the more extreme pronouncements that I tend to hear, there was a professional development group that was actually doing some work in Michigan in which they said, don't read aloud to kids till third grade.
Oh my goodness.
So can you believe that?
Why?
Of course, I got plenty of, communications from people, attending that. Like, can you believe what? And from teachers attending that, pushing back. I do think that, at least my experience is that some of those loudest voices that are, just sort of myopically focusing on one aspect of reading, or, are saying this is bad, this is good. They're often not actual classroom teachers. I think that classroom teachers, very, very often do recognize, because they have the reality of the kids in front of them every day, and the kids are teaching them themselves. This is, sort of all of the different ways in which they can have strengths and weaknesses in their learning. So I think we all just have to band together, and we hear somebody say, build knowledge, but don't teach strategies, or they say, teach decoding, but don't teach comprehension, or, develop narrative comprehension, but don't do informational comprehension, or do informational comprehension, but don't do story comprehension, or whatever people are out there doing. We just have to bring that critical eye, and kind of put ourselves in that public health shoes, put ourselves in the public health shoes. That does not sound right at all. Put ourselves in the shoes of someone in public health to make sure that, we're bringing that critical eye and that lens of complexity.
Yeah. So speaking of this, like focusing in on one area, I have your other article in mind that we read before we talked to you. And I loved just the title of it, honestly, because it's the science of, I'm going to get it wrong. The science of reading, comprehension, instruction. And I always talk about this to Lori, I think, especially because I was a secondary teacher. I'm like, the science of reading, like so often gets talked about only in this word recognition part of it. And we both are like, there's science that also talks about the comprehension part of it too. But not a lot of people are talking about that part. So I was really excited to see your article that kind of brings that a little bit more to light. So I'd love to hear about that other article as well.
Oh, thanks so much. So that second article you're talking about, the science of reading comprehension and instruction, was published in the Reading Teacher. It was absolutely written for practitioners, and it's also freely available online, open access. So we hope people might check it out. I would like
I'll link that as well now.
Pardon me?
Oh, I said I'll link that as well. I'll link both of your pieces.
Oh, thanks so much. And you might not even need a pina colada for this one. I mean, you'll have to decide what you think. I don't want to give us too much credit, but and this was co-authored with Alessandra Ward and with P. David Pearson. And just to put it a little bit in historical context, David Pearson and I, with collaborators, have published a piece about every decade for practitioners where we try to pull together, what we think research is suggesting about elementary reading comprehension instruction, and we were due for a piece. So that's really what this particular piece is, and I hope it will be useful to people. The first thing that I should say about it is as you pointed out, we really want people to understand, which every researcher I know understands. So I don't think this is a controversial statement at all, that the science of reading encompasses not just word reading, but there's lots of scientific research around other kinds of processes that are going on in one's mind as they read, and lots of scientific research. I call it the science of reading instruction, that gets at the instructional context and instructional moves that support reading development. So, so thanks. I appreciate that you both read the piece. I guess I can just, summarize for the listeners that what we did in the piece is we identified some findings from research that we think are pretty robust, that there's quite a bit of agreement on within from study to study, and a fair amount of research on. So, for example, our first point is that teaching word reading and bridging skills supports reading comprehension. That's a I'd be hard pressed to find anyone who disagrees with that, right?
Yeah.
So that's an example of a kind of finding that we share in the piece, and then with each one we do try to point to some sort of practical directions for instruction. In the piece, we do have a graphic, as you both know, so your readers know there's a graphic, the layered model of reading comprehension instruction.
Yep.
And
it looks like a layer cake, but reverse, like a reverse wedding cake, if you will.
Thank you. That is a very, that's a very good, with that ombre, for those of you who are familiar with that ombre, that fading of color, right? Yeah. And so part of what we were trying to do there is actually get at something that both of you have raised, this sort of either or idea that often doesn't serve our field very well. So, instead of kind of a metaphor of, say, a balance scale where you maybe put like knowledge building on one end and comprehension instruction on the other, in the layered model, we suggest that comprehension instruction is layered inside of the engagement with texts to in part build knowledge. So these things don't happen in different parts of the day. These things are, really, really embedded and integrated. So if I could go back to your daughter for a minute, Lori, we did talk about the importance of, that comprehension monitoring as well as her word reading. But a sort of another layer up from that is, why is she reading? If you're just reading to finish an assignment and you don't have much, sort of interest in the assignment that you're doing, you're going to be less likely to apply those good comprehension strategies, slow down when you need to, worry about accuracy and so on, right?
Yeah.
But if you embed or layer that reading experience inside a motivating context, she's reading this because then she's going to give a presentation for preschoolers about some information she learned, or she's reading this because she's going to come to school with her peers who read other articles and they're going to jigsaw and share what one another learned, for the purpose of a project they're working on. That's where we start to see a context that makes it more likely that we will, that we'll do things like monitor our comprehension carefully and so on. And so in our layered model, readers will see that we didn't just focus narrowly on literacy. We tried to kind of the top of that inverted layer cake, to use Lori's description, also deals with just generally good classroom practice and context, and deals with literacy and reading motivation, and so on. So that's what we were trying to do there with that graphic.
Yeah. What stood out to me, I think, is that you really draw attention to embedding strategies within the knowledge building constructs. It's not, like you said, like team strategy or team knowledge building. It really fits together. And Melissa, I'm wondering if it might be helpful for us to give an example. I know we always speak to wit and wisdom because that's what we know. Do you want to try to give an example, Melissa, within the content stages?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and this kind of was in my head when you were talking earlier, Nell, about the self-questioning and self-monitoring. And I was thinking, like, within Wit and Wisdom, there's the first content, or the first stage is about noticing and wondering, right? Just like getting students to see, what do you wonder about this text? What do you notice about this text? And to me, that's like starting to, we call it like, replicating these habits that they can start to like use as they get to other texts on their own. You might have more, Lori. That's just where my head was. But I love that about Wit and Wisdom, is that it's like, it's almost so like inside of the knowledge building text and the engagement of these texts that it's almost not noticeable, if that makes any sense, but it's there. And I love that, because when I taught, I did it the wrong way, right? When I had a self-questioning day, and we're going to learn how to question. Yeah. And here's this random text that I have here for us to practice questioning. And then I'm going to see if you can do it and check off the box that says, oh yes, Lori can ask questions, but now not so much. Let's try it again next time. Right. And like, that didn't make any sense.
Yeah. So well, I may have been able to ask questions because I was super interested in what we were reading about, right? It might have been a topic, right? Something that was familiar to me, and Nell might have had no idea what the topic was. But yeah, I think, like, going back to your point, Nell, a moment ago, that when we embed those habits of mind with and teach strategies within knowledge building, that helps students be curious learners. It helps them to ask questions as they read. It helps them to, have a bigger purpose. And also, when we do it within knowledge building, what I think helps me frame it is that it's not like this jigsaw, like different topics. It's a really fluid, topical alignment where students are learning about a topic to really become an expert on it and to be able to know about that specific topic. So really the intrinsical motivation could be to know more about a specific topic and to investigate questions within that, which is highly motivating for students just as kids. They're curious in nature. So that's what I always think about. And then, like Melissa said, it's embedded within, like, it has that wonder is the first stage, but organize is the second. And you're asking like, what is happening in this text? And reveal, and you're looking a little bit deeper to see what something reveals about the text. Distilling, what's the essential meaning? And how does this build my knowledge? So students are able to pull specific pieces that are going to help build their understanding so that they eventually can know more about a topic and then apply that. And I mean, if that's not motivating, I don't know what is. Like, I want to become an expert on lots of the topics that, a lot of the high quality curricula that is out there addresses, because I feel like we didn't get to do that when we were in school. And it is pretty amazing to feel like a historian or to feel like a scientist and to know that information. It's empowering.
Yeah. And I do think I think when I was teaching, at least, I think like some of these things fell into different buckets. Like I'm going to teach vocabulary over here separately. I'm going to teach, I'm going to do some motivation over here by having them do some like self-selected reading. I'm going to do, this something else over here about the strategy is totally separate, right?
Yeah.
Like it was like you said, trying to do things separately instead of like, how do we actually bring it all together?
Yeah. Nell, you mentioned a piece in your, not you, but you and your team in the piece that we're talking about now, the science of reading comprehension instruction. Melissa, when you said self-selected reading, it made me think about the part toward the end. Reading. Yeah, that talked about volume reading. Would you be able, Nell, just very quickly, I know we're over time, but to talk about that, I loved this. This is really, really important, I think. So would you be able to draw that out and just quickly talk about it before we close out?
Sure. So, I mean, if you think of anything that people try to get good at, playing the violin, swimming, whatever the case may be, it's hard to deny that an important part of that is you have to do the thing a lot. You got to swim a lot to become a really good swimmer, right? Yeah. And you have to play the violin a lot to become a very good violinist. And the same is true for reading. Our strongest readers need to spend a lot of time reading. The conundrum here that I think our field has really struggled with for a long time now is how do you make that happen? So, one model is, well, you take large chunks of the school day and you just have kids read. Well, when that gets tested in research against more instructionally oriented activities, it typically loses. That is, just this kind of old model where the teacher, sits and reads something the teacher's interested in, and the students all, sit and read something they're interested in. For example, often called deer time. You drop everything and read. I call it drop everything and find Waldo because, so often the kids are, doing something like reading Where's Waldo, or, something that probably isn't doing a lot, to further their reading ability with all due respect. I mean, those books are really fun, but in terms of, some of the kinds of reading moves that we need students to make. Anyway, so if giving over large swaths of the day to kids just sort of reading whatever they want and the teacher reading whatever they want, if that doesn't work, what does work? What's going to create a situation in which students have adequate time to do this thing that you have to do a lot to get good at, right? Not to mention that it builds knowledge, per the examples the two of you were giving, shortly ago. So certainly one thing is looking at outside of school time. And there are definitely a number of studies, and I think we cite a review in the paper, if I remember correctly, on what happens when we make sure that students have access to books over summer and have, some mechanisms that encourage them to really read those books over the summer. And some of those approaches do work very well to improve reading achievement. So, that outside of school reading is one way that we can do it. Another way we can do it is through partner or dyad reading. At least some versions of partner dyad reading have been tested in research and shown to be effective. So that reading with that partner, where you have certain ways that you and the partner are supporting one another in the reading, that seems to be a promising mechanism. Situations in which students are reading with a higher degree of teacher instructional support, whether that's that they're reading to immediately try out something that they were learning, or they're, in their instruction, rereading a text that they had initially encountered in instruction, rereading that multiple times. doing readers theater to improve fluency, where, the teacher is there really guiding that reading development and connecting that reading to the meaning of whatever the text is that they're doing readers theater. Those are some of the kinds of things, that have that additional layer of scaffolding that's important. And then, of course, now with artificial intelligence and so forth, there are increasing numbers of programs that are designed to where the computer is listening to children read and responding in one way or another. So eventually, we'll have that too. But I think
so, do you think Alexa will ever be able to give feedback?
Yes. I do. I absolutely
Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
I'm just being funny, but
there
oh my gosh.
I won't name specific companies because I'll get in trouble if I name some and not others, but there are companies right now working on exactly that idea, and researchers who've long been working on that idea. Jack Mostow at Carnegie Mellon, for example, has been working on that idea for many years. So yes, but the larger kind of context and issue here really is that, we do need students to read a lot. That's not going to teach them to read. So let's be very clear. As always, this is one piece of a larger pie of things that need to happen, but we do need students to read a lot. We accomplish that partly by making sure that our motivational mechanisms are in place, that we're creating a really motivating context for students to read. And then we accomplish that best outside of school through, various kinds of book access programs with various enhancements. Inside of school, we accomplish it by having a heavier layer of collaboration and instructional scaffolding rather than a traditional, quote, silent reading model.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I Melissa, were you a deer? Did you do deer in your classroom back in the day? I did.
Let's not talk about it, Lori.
I know. I was like, I didn't think that sitting in the front of the classroom and reading would help anybody else read. That doesn't make any sense, but it was.
I thought I was doing the right thing.
I know.
You guys.
We're going to do a know better, do better. Confessions.
Again, just to wrap up, because I think it's the theme of our whole conversation, that's science, right? 30 years ago, there were all sorts of things we did that we thought would help our health. And later we've learned they don't really help. Or there were things that, I remember when I was growing up, you just the kids didn't wear seatbelts. We're climbing all over the back seat.
Right. You know what? We were watching the original Full House the other night. Oh my gosh, they're in a convertible crossing the Golden Gate Bridge with kids in the front seat, kids in the back seat, no car seats. I don't even know if anybody had seatbelts on. I was like, oh my gosh, no, I would never, but you're right. If we went by those constructs, we would not be very safe today. So thank goodness for science, right?
That's it right there, Lori. Thank goodness for science.
No, we would love to invite you. Well, first we want to thank you for your time, but we would love to invite you to share one final piece of advice with our listeners, because we think everything that we've talked about today has been so valuable. But if you can funnel it down to just one final piece of advice that is going to be the last thing that they hear from you before you leave, we'd love to ask you for that.
Ooh, that's a tough one, Lori. I think I would ask everybody, first of all, we're coming off such a hard year and a half. And so just on the affective side, I just have to say, let's give ourselves some grace. Let's give our children and our students some grace. Let's give our colleagues some grace going into this year. Get back to the things that are most important for, our growth and for our children's growth. So I feel like I need to say that, but on the sort of side that's more in the technical aspects of things, I would just say that there are a lot of people out there right now talking about the science of reading who do not know what scientific research on reading actually finds, whose understandings are outdated or outright wrong, who don't actually read research studies, who don't or read just a few, cherry-picked research studies and don't look at the whole volume of literature. And I just would ask, all of your listeners to really be critical consumers of people's pronouncements about science and make sure, that you can really trust that who you're reading and hearing from has actually read lots and lots and lots of scientific research, or is working with people who have read lots and lots of scientific research, and that, they are really accurately representing the science, just as I would hope your listeners would feel that way about any given public health issue, that they should bring that same critical lens that hopefully they're bringing, to issues of public health, to issues around, science and reading. And so I guess I'd leave it at that. And thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful. Really such a pleasure to talk with the two of you, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I learned so much.
I know, it was amazing. Actually, what you just said now reminds me of, we talked with James Murphy, who edited the Research Ed Guide to Literacy. And he had this concept of truth versus truthy, and how teachers need to be aware of what is truthful versus truthy. And I was like, I love that so much. So I'm going to throw back to an episode that we've just published, and hopefully our listeners can get a little more from that one after hearing your plug to be knowing what is truth versus truthy. Wonderful. So thank you so much. Now have a wonderful day. We appreciate your time so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.